Yes, we are. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and get started.
Yes, we can start.
Okay. All right, well, welcome everybody to our third CNI colloquium event of the semester. For anybody who missed it, Matt Villeneuve's talk from a couple of weeks ago on John Dewey and Indigenous education will be up on the website soon. We do have a recording of that, as well as the earlier event this semester on navigating the job market, academic job market. We are also going to be having Dr. April Baker-Bell on Monday, December 12th for another colloquium talk. So if that's not on your calendar yet, we hope you can join us for that. I want to offer also lots of thanks as we're getting started here. This talk is co-sponsored by LACI, Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies Program, as well as the Chicano and Latino-Latina Studies Program here at UW-Madison, as well as University Lectures. So lots of support and excitement for this talk today. I also want to acknowledge Diego Roman and Noah Weinstein, who contributed a lot to pulling this visit together. And with that, I will hand it to Diego and Scarlett, one of the grad student reps on the colloquium committee, to introduce Dr. Morales-Doyle.
Thank you everyone for being here today. I am super excited and honored to introduce Dr. Danny Morales-Doyle. He's an associate professor of science education at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I met Danny through his work in social justice center science pedagogy, working with Latinx communities in inner city Chicago. We read his work as part of the course that Katie and I taught about decolonizing schooling and science and language, which we will be teaching if you're interested in those topics. Please talk to Katie and I. We will be teaching it next semester, next year. So I met Danny through his work, and then we are fellows, Spencer Fellows of the postdoctoral fellowship of 2020. But because of the pandemic, we never met in person. All of our events were online. But we finally met Katie, Nicole. We were 2 weeks ago in DC, attending the Spencer get together for the first time in person. And we got the chance to talk, and I was so happy to learn more about his work and the work that he's doing, especially in inner city Chicago with Latinx communities. So now I am going to introduce Scarlett Juan, who is a doctoral student here in science instruction, science education, and language, who will be introducing Danny, Dr. Morales-Doyle. Thank you, Diego.
Hi, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Scarlett Huang. I'm a PhD candidate in science education. It's my honor and privilege to introduce Professor Daniel Morales-Doyle. Dr. Daniel Morales-Doyle is an associate professor of science education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He was a high school teacher in the Chicago public schools for more than a decade before joining the faculty at UIC. He has received several grants from the National Science Foundation and has published in various journals, such as Science Education, Journal of Research in Science Teaching, Cultural Studies in Science Education, etc. His research examines the potential for science education to act as a catalyst for social transformation. His work focuses in particular on the contested ways in which the concept of equity has been defined in the science education literature. Indeed, as school districts across the US have adopted equity as a central goal, the way this concept is defined in the science education literature has become more contested. In Chicago, the nation's fourth largest school district, and equity rationale motivated narrowing the high school graduation requirements to prescribe 1 year each of biology, chemistry, and physics. At the same time, scholars have been arguing for more expensive definitions of equity that extend beyond providing minoritized students with access to disciplinary canons. Furthermore, local examples of how the chemistry industry operates challenge assumptions embedded in many mainstream diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Within this context, This talk describes a study that began by broadly asking what kind of professional learning can support in-service science teachers to facilitate class projects that use youth participatory science to address environmental racism. Through a participatory design-based approach, the study documents an extensive shift towards prioritizing historical context and argues for a redefinition of the relationships between education research and teacher professional learning. The implications of this work include new models for co-constructing professional learning agendas with teachers and others involved in educational change. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Morales-Doyle.
So thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. Thank you, especially Nicole, Diego, Noah, Scarlett, and everybody else who was involved and helped organize this visit. I'm really impressed with the community that you all have up here. Short drive up from Chicago. I'm especially humbled to have the opportunity not only to speak to you today, but also to meet with teachers and activists later today. So I call this talk STEM Pipeline or Catalyst for Change, Science Teachers Negotiating Contested Definitions of Equity. And I'll try to be concise so that we have time for some dialogue at the end. So I really like the word catalyst. I like that catalyst for change metaphor. It's funny, I was actually talking with one of your colleagues, Diana Rodriguez Gomez, about how we share a love for that word, catalyst. She used it to describe some of the really cool work she's doing around youth voice and the politics of the war on drugs. For me, the word catalyst is in my dissertation title, is in my first peer-reviewed journal article. It's a metaphor I grew up with. My father is a community organizer, and so that catalyst for change metaphor is familiar to me. But then when I studied chemistry as an undergraduate, catalysis was actually my favorite topic, also as a chemistry student. So I'm looking at that from different ways. I really like the way the idea a catalyst is about providing an alternative pathway towards outcomes we desire, and that maybe that change that we want to happen can happen under conditions that are less harsh. Right, so that's the idea of a catalyst that I like. But my presentation begins today not with metaphoric catalysts, but with literal chemical catalysts in a place where I didn't expect to find them. Okay, so this is an image from a high school baseball program. The neighborhood high school that's 2 blocks from my house. My children go to the feeder elementary school, and and a teacher I work with sent this to me. So you go to the varsity baseball game. On one page you have the roster of the baseball team. And the next page, you have this advertisement, right? So it's a sponsored advertisement from a local business. And so the ad explains how this chemical plant in our neighborhood, which looms over a popular taqueria across the street, produces inorganic chemical catalysts. Not the kind of catalysis I like, but for petroleum refining and the petrochemical industries, all right? So why you want to know this when you go to a high school baseball game, I'm not sure, but that's what the ad says. And so that actually reminded me of another metaphor that's really common in my field, science education, which is the metaphor of the STEM pipeline, right? And a lot of, as diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives become more and more popular, more and more mainstream, a lot of them position that work as providing access to this STEM pipeline for minoritized young people, right? And specifically, I view it as a pretty accurate metaphor, even though I dislike the metaphor, because it's extractive, right? That's a model where science education, STEM education extracts the human resources from communities and puts them in service of national interests like the military or the national economy, right? So even more in the STEM, in the pipeline model, and we think about those catalysts that are manufactured down the street from my house, being used in oil refining. In oil refining, there's these processes which are basically about separating the quote unquote more valuable parts of the mixture from the less valuable parts of the mixture. And the way tracking and selective schools and that kind of thing operates in the STEM pipeline is kind of very similar in terms of how they view students as literal human resources, to be extracted from their communities and separated into their more valuable and less valuable parts, right? So if you want to get really nerdy with me on these chemical engineering metaphors, I have a chapter where I go there, but I won't continue all the way down that road right now. Try and bring it back to something a little more practical. a little less metaphoric, and talk about graduation requirements for high schools, right? So Chicago actually just became the fourth largest, for a very long time was the third largest nation school district in the country. Miami-Dade County just passed because CPS has been losing students for about 10 years. So prior to 2017, 5 years ago, these were the graduation requirements in science. You had to have that 1 year of biology, and then you could choose from other science classes. These were the most common ones, but there could actually be other ones. It was a little more wide open. As long as there was a lab component and it was called science, you could take biology and then 2 more years of those sciences, right? So last year's graduating class, 2021, 2 years ago, I guess, was the first graduating class to be held to new standards. And the reason these new standards came about is a lot of schools were using earth and space sciences and environmental science courses as basically remedial courses where they could dump students who they deemed not ready for the biochem physics college preparatory type of sequence, right? And so the district identified that as a problem of equity. And, you know, as Katie's work points out, having access to that college preparatory rigorous coursework is one of the ways in which racially discriminatory and inequitable structures are maintained in science education, right? And so it's a problem of tracking. Now, unfortunately, to the district's credit, they were trying to solve that problem of inequity, right? And they were trying to make things more equitable. And so I think their reasons for making this change were headed in the right direction. But the problem is they conflated tracking with these more interdisciplinary courses, right? And so they essentially got rid of these more interdisciplinary courses because as soon as they're not graduation requirements, then under-resourced schools can't really offer them anymore, right? And so this study is about taking up the contradictions we see in these different definitions of equity. Is equity just access to these college preparatory courses, or is it something else, right? To essentially eliminate earth and environmental sciences from the high school curriculum at a time of climate crisis around the world and specific local ecological emergencies in Chicago seems a little short-sighted to me. So again, while I disagreed with this policy change, it was well thought out in some other ways, right? So the district was making an informed decision based on some other national types of reforms and changes that were happening in science education, right? So they were thinking their process through to the level of curriculum at the central district office, where the NGSS, the Next Generation Science Standards, offer opportunities for courses like chemistry, physics, and biology to be more interdisciplinary, right? Because of the way the NGSS elevate practices to the level of disciplinary core ideas, because of the way that the performance expectations allow teachers to bundle the disciplinary core ideas from chemistry with the disciplinary core ideas of earth and space science, for example, right? And so they saw opportunities to say, teach about ocean acidification in chemistry class as mitigating the fact that they were essentially cutting out earth and environmental science from high schools, right? So and my work is situated very specifically in the local context of Chicago, but these are national changes, right? These are changes that we see reflected in all of the major science curricula being published right now in the United States. So, and I think these shifts represent a step forward in science education in a lot of ways. I think there's the potential to make science classes more meaningful for more students, but I think they also suffer from a lack of contextualization, right? So along with the shift towards elevating the practices and to the level of core ideas, the science and engineering practices to the level of disciplinary core ideas, another part of this shift is that curriculum become planned around phenomena instead of being planned around scientific topics, right? So again, to use the previous example, instead of having a unit in your chemistry class on acids and bases as a science concept, you might study the phenomenon of ocean acidification, right? The problem is that phenomena happen in context. They happen in social, cultural, historical, and political contexts. And that's not always accounted for to the extent that I think it should be, right? But the point I'm gonna try to make here is that not only do phenomena happen in context, but all those practices happen in context too, right? The enterprise of science happens in context, right? And so what I mean is, like, if we're thinking about access to the scientific disciplines, we have to recognize that the disciplines are actually not, the NGSS does a good job of pointing out that science disciplines are not just their core ideas, right, which has been a problem of science teaching for a long time. There are also practices, right, science and engineering practices. There are also cross-cutting concepts, but science is also more than that, right? Some people say it's also communities of practitioners, communities of scientists represent science, right? But I would say it's more than that too. Science is a set of institutions, right? And it's an enterprise. And so beyond just being communities of scientists, there's universities, there's funding agencies, there's corporations, right? There's institutions of science which make it an enterprise, right? So when it comes to chemistry, I'm gonna go back to the neighborhood where I live, right? So this is the plant that took out that ad in the high school baseball program. And so the neighborhood I live, Chicago's a hyper segregated city. The neighborhood where I live, 84% of the residents are Latinx. And when it comes to high school age youth, well over 90% of the high school age youth are Latinx. And so in that context, when I'm teaching chemistry, the disciplinary core ideas and the practices of chemistry happen in our neighborhood more than anywhere else in this place, right? Now, I also want to emphasize that in my neighborhood context, I fit into this intentionally broad and problematic census category of Hispanic, right? But I also have white privilege that most of my neighbors don't. Most of my neighbors have roots in Mexico. I have 3 of my grandparents are of Irish descent, and my Morales grandfather is from a small community, a Spanish-speaking community in Louisiana called Los Isleños, right? And so there's a privilege there that's important for me to recognize. My Morales grandfather actually came to Chicago from Louisiana to work in a meatpacking plant, right? And his job in the meatpacking plant was interesting. He was a laborer, right? He didn't have a lot of formal education, but so his job, when you slaughter a lot of animals, you have a lot of excess fat, right? That doesn't get eaten. And so anyone who's familiar with the chemistry of soap knows that that excess fat can be treated with a strong base, we might call lye, sodium hydroxide, potassium hydroxide, to turn it into soap. So my grandfather's job in the meatpacking plant, one of the most infamous and largest meatpacking plants on the south side of Chicago, right, the hog butcher to the world, was pouring the strong base into the vats of fat to make soap. He did the saponification reaction, right? So now as a laborer, he wasn't probably ever in his life considered a chemist, but my mom has memories of her dad bringing home bottles of glycerin, right? Which is the byproduct of that reaction. And she would use the glycerin to blow bubbles, right? You mix soap and glycerin and you get that really perfect bubble mixture. And so as a little girl, she would blow bubbles with the big vats of glycerin that her dad brought home from work, right? Now, a funds of knowledge approach to teaching science would recognize that people like my grandfather have rich scientific knowledge, right? That they built through work, right? And so that's an important perspective that, of course, Norma Gonzalez and Luis Moll brought into education, and Angie Calabrese-Spartan and Tam brought into science education. But I think we need to go even beyond funds of knowledge to contend with the fact that beyond just recognizing that as scientific knowledge, we also have to recognize that the chemical industry, right? And you could say the same for biotech, you could say the same for the military when it comes to physics, has had a substantial role in defining what counts as learning chemistry in chemistry class, right? They have very much defined what the practices and core ideas of chemistry are. And we see that in the standards in a performance expectation like this, right? Where the performance expectation expects that students can refine the design of a chemical system by specifying a change in conditions that would produce increased products at equilibrium. That's an industrial view of what the study of molecules is, right? So it fits very well, again, more or less with what they do in this place, right? As articulated in their ads in our high school baseball program. Right. So besides shaping what counts as chemistry, the chemical industry also has a lot of other problematic historical and present involvements, right? So most of the reactions they do are not as benign even as the reaction that my grandfather did to make soap, right? From a strong base and fat. And so this particular company that owns this plant in our neighborhood has paid the US EPA just in the last decade or so, $63 million in fines for cleaning up toxic waste sites they have scattered around the country. This particular site has not been part of that, but 15 minutes down the road, they have another site, right, that needed cleanup, right? And so as somebody who lives down the street from this, that worries me, right? As a side note, there's this whole really fascinating history of this company connected to what Eduardo Galeano called the open veins of Latin America that I could tell another time. I'm just starting that paper, but there's a really interesting history behind this too. But basically, suffice it to say that when we're talking about participation in the STEM pipeline in my neighborhood, the clearest example of that is this place, right? And if equity is about funneling minoritized students into the STEM pipeline, we have to grapple with the fact that this place may also be doing us harm, right? Situated in our neighborhood. And we actually, in some ways, it's very clear that it is, and in other ways, it's a little more tricky, right? And so scholars have been articulating more expansive visions of science education through things like supporting epistemic heterogeneity, science education aligned with social movements, science education requiring a socio-political turn. So there are these broader, more expansive visions of equity that we see in the literature that aren't just about access to the STEM pipeline, right? And so from those perspectives, instead of simply focusing on broadening participation in the sciences, we might encourage young people to take up scientific practices to wonder whether whatever they're doing in here is safe, sustainable, and just, right? And so the symbol part, like I said, we know they're involved with the petrochemical industry. So on that level, we know not sustainable, right? Part of climate crisis. We know that they've been fined tens of millions, and if you add it up over longer than that, hundreds of millions of dollars for their role in environmental contamination with toxic waste. So it's another thing that gives us pause with that question. But when it comes to the specific molybdenum-based pollution that's coming out of that smokestack, we actually don't understand very much about the health implications of that, right? There's actually pretty unsettled science on that, right? And so the local high school where that baseball program came from, a teacher who I have the opportunity to collaborate there, his name is Tomasz Rasky, has been working on a project with the students to try and figure some of those things out, right? And it started from the baseball program. But I just also want to take a moment to highlight some of the ways in which your colleagues here at Wisconsin are also informing the way I'm thinking about this, right? I've been thinking with Diego and learning from him about how doing this kind of work is much different in an urban context where this is a small part of our larger economy versus a rural Wisconsin context, like the dairy industry, for example, where doing this kind of work has a different set of contradictions and complications, right? I alluded to it before, but Katie's work has been helping me think about how this kind of work is different from more patronizing and colonizing ways that science education has tried to make themselves relevant in Latinx communities in the past and present, right? And I think Maxine McKinney de Royston's work has really been helping me think about the political clarity required by teachers to do this kind of work, and also the ways in which, I love the term that her and her Saper Vakil used, positioning students as philosophers of technology, right? So those are some of the ways that I'm really proud to be a part of a community of educators who's establishing this vision of science education that prepares students with knowledge that's sophisticated enough to work as a chemical engineer in this place, and political analysis that's sophisticated enough to do something else with that knowledge. So given all of that, I'm going to shift to describing a study that's about what kinds of supports or learning teachers need to do to pick up a project like this and run with it in their high school chemistry classroom. So about 5 years ago, around the same time the graduation requirements changed, a group of us formalized long-time informal ongoing collaborations with some funding from NSF, and we call ourselves the Youth Participatory Science Collective. Right now, that collective includes about 10 high school teachers, 3 scientists, some community organizers, and young people who come in and out of the space with teachers' invitations. My co-authors and closest collaborators on this particular study are Alejandra Fausto Aceves, who's here in the back, Mindy Chappell, and Alejandra's a grad student at Northwestern University right now. Mindy Chappell, who is at Portland State University right now, and Tiffany Childers-Price, who is a chemistry teacher at South Shore International College Prep in Chicago. And all of us on this author list were high school chemistry teachers for like 10 years or more at some point. So our broader project together focused on supporting youth participatory science projects to address urban heavy metal contamination, of which the molybdenum pollution from that plant I showed you may or may not be a part. We actually don't know, again, how molybdenum actually impacts the environment or our health. But here are some of the other sources and movements against those sources of heavy metal contamination in Chicago, from lead pipes, peeling lead paint, coal power plants that have recently been demolished after the community fought for a long time to have them shut down, metal scrapping plants, pet coke piles, and some of the movements for environmental justice in our communities on the south and west sides of Chicago, pushing back against all of this. So we think of youth participatory science, YPS, as sitting somewhere between YPAR, Youth Participatory Action Research, and citizen science, right? And so Alejandro and I wrote a piece that defines the sort of 5 phases of our curriculum framework. But I won't get into the details of that here, but I will say that I'll have a slide later that shows kind of to what extent teachers were able to complete this cycle the first year that we were working together a little bit later on. So that's why I show it to you here. So our project kind of began from an educational research perspective with this broad question of like, what kinds of learning do teachers need to do to carry out youth participatory science projects in their high school chemistry class, right? That was kind of like our broad thinking. And we thought a lot of that would focus on reformulations of pedagogical content knowledge, right? Because teaching chemistry and the pedagogical content knowledge it requires to teach chemistry is much different when you have sort of predetermined, packaged, well thought out phenomena, as opposed to when you're dealing with like real authentic environmental problems in the neighborhood, right? Which is much messier. So we thought, like, just to give you an example, that instrument back there is called an inductively coupled plasma atomic emission spectrometer, which is a mouthful. And I had no idea what it was when we started doing this work, right? That instrument didn't exist when I got my degree in chemistry. So I thought a lot of our learning would be focused on like learning about stuff like that. What is that thing? How does it work? How does it help us measure heavy metal contamination in the soil in our neighborhood? But the story I'm going to tell through data is about a shift that happened away from that perspective, right? And specifically, I'm going to deal with this second refined research question, which is how can this heterogeneous group of teachers, scientists, community organizers, young people reach consensus about the forms of teacher professional learning that are important to prioritize if we want to do these youth participatory science projects in our classrooms? And that kind of question challenges the traditional relationships between educational research and teacher professional development as they have traditionally been situated or done. So much of the research, there's a lot of disagreements and contestations in the teacher education research, first of all, about whether we need to prioritize issues of, you know, political consciousness, ideological change versus issues of like core practices, right? And there's been some people that have tried to bring those perspectives together too. But actually, a lot of the research, not all, but a lot of the research in both of those camps still kind of looks at it like researchers know what teachers need. And research on teacher learning is about, let's do something and figure out if we can move teachers towards what we know they need, right? And so this takes a different perspective and says, if we're about educational change making, and we're about imagining new forms of schooling, and we're about transformation, then we don't know any better than the teachers know. We have different perspectives. So do the community organizers working with, so do the scientists, so do the young people, so do their parents. If we're about transformation, then none of us knows better than the other. We actually all need each other to try and figure out what are the priorities for teacher professional learning. So with that in mind, we consider our work to be participatory design research, right? Our project assumes that teachers are at the cutting edge of educational transformation, right? And it sounds a lot like co-design. We work together to co-design curriculum for sure. We use participatory design instead of co-design because of the ways we're trying to flatten the hierarchies between our roles. We recognize that we have different roles. That's actually important because people have different constraints in their different roles. But we're trying to flatten sort of epistemic hierarchies in our roles. So this first study focuses on a 6-month period, this study, first one, but it focuses on a 6-month period from our first institute, where we all met together formally to plan out YPS projects, and our second institute, which was about 6 months later, right? And so in terms of data, we've got teacher interviews, audio and video recordings of those 7 days of professional development, 5 from the first institute, 2 from the second institute, and a lot of written reflections from teachers, and also a set of reflective presentations that they did together. So as I mentioned, we expected to focus on like pedagogical content knowledge issues in the realm of chemistry. But as we were working together, and this came 6 months, this came on that second day of that second institute, there's a snapshot of a blackboard, we had fully shifted away from that, right? And as a group, we had this aha moment, we had reached this consensus, this moment of an expansive shift in our learning of, we need to focus on learning history. Us as a group of scientists and chemistry teachers and community organizers, we need to learn history. That's what we need to focus the second half of our second institute on, right? And so what this study is kind of like going back and trying to figure out, how did we get there, right? How did we collectively come to that realization? So what we did in terms of looking at that data, we identified every time someone brought up history, right? And there's 216 instances in those data sources I mentioned of somebody bringing up, hey, I think we should look at history, right? And then we found which days of the institutes were those mentions of history concentrated, right? And then we look more closely at those days, and then we zoom down, drill down even more to look at the richest exchanges from those days to figure out if history was raised, how come we didn't continue down that path, right? Until 6 months later, when we finally did, right? And what was different 6 months later than at the beginning when people were mentioning history? So just to give you a sense of what these institutes look like, so you can understand how the timeline works, right? We organize all that data into a timeline. The first institute was designed around this idea that all of our different constituency groups are experts whose expertise we need. They have different sorts of expertise, but it's all equally important. So the first day of the first institute starts with a presentation by community organizers working on issues of environmental racism, right? Then we have a small group debrief about, well, what does what they said have to do with teaching science, right? And then in the afternoon, teachers work on curriculum. We come back day 2, we have a youth panel, right? Because the youth's voice are super important in what we're doing. Day 3, our scientists share some of the science behind what we're doing, the analytical techniques from a chemistry perspective. Day 4 was all teachers working together, and then on day 5, teachers shared back by doing some of the activities they were planning with the group, right, and getting everybody else's feedback. And so what we saw is on these first 3 days of the institute, teachers, and it was especially teachers, were bringing up history a lot, actually. But the conversations were always, they would bring it up and the conversation would go somewhere else. And I'm gonna show you how it happened in a second. But because that conversation always went somewhere else, when teachers worked together on curriculum for extended periods of time, history didn't really come up at all, right? And because it didn't come up while they were working on curriculum, when they shared their curriculum, there wasn't really any history there either. So I'm going to show you one example of a conversation where this history gets raised and then we get diverted, right? And then I'm going to explain how this was part of a pattern that we saw. So this is one excerpt from one 1-hour small group conversation after the scientists presented to us on the 3rd day of the institute. And so I'm going to try to play the audio so you can follow along that way.
The priority concept is still wasn't, for me, the priority wasn't the historical. Because like they learned like you just really break that down in the plain text. So like that chemistry part is there for them to be able to talk about different
I think it's also, so I've had this situation before, where it's really important that we know the quantitative aspects of it too. Like what findings would be abnormal, what findings would be considered normal levels, in order for their findings to actually have been has to do with them understanding just the units that they're using, which I don't think necessarily is important to teach conversion, you know, in this unit, but I think it's important that they know how those units relate to like dimensions, like that nature.
So what you see is Mindy, who's a teacher, raising history is a priority for me, right? And she explains why. And then Cedric, another teacher, shifts it to say, well, but the quantitative aspects of what we're doing is important too. If students are going to understand how to measure levels of pollution, they need to understand the units of measurement they're using. And the scientist in the group picks that up and says, even my seniors in college have a hard time with that, right? And so very legitimate priority for science teachers here, but diverting us away from Mindy's idea that the history was important. So that's one example of 5 different times almost that same thing happened during that one conversation, right? And it's illustrative of other conversations that are happening during that day and during those first 3 days of Institute 1. So it started with Mindy actually asking Faith about how to find historical maps of where industries were located in the city, especially around her school, right? And Faith starts to answer her question, but then she realizes the young person in the group hasn't said anything. And so she's like, wait, let's make sure we have the young person involved in this conversation. And it starts a really good conversation about how you make sure there's equity of voice in a classroom discussion. Again, super important pedagogical discussion that's important for science teachers to be taking up, but it diverts us away from Mindy's point about history. Cedric, though, on his own, took up this and starts looking for maps online on his laptop, right? But then, so he brings it up. But then that conversation got shifted to what if we could map the data we're collecting, the environmental data, and use GIS software to make maps of heavy metal contamination data. Again, excellent idea, not history. Then comes the example we just heard. Then later, Mindy brings up history again, but the conversation shifts to talk about, well, like how hyperlocal do we have to be for this to be called place-based education, right? Interesting question, but diverts the conversation. And finally, Cedric brings history up in a slightly different context where he's saying, I teach in a really old school building. I know there's lead paint in the school building. I know there's lead pipes in the school building. And then Alejandra actually took it off from there to talk about the logistics of organizing a group of 28 high school sophomores to get out into the community and take soil samples from the neighborhood, right? Because that's actually a logistically complex thing for teachers to do, right? So again, an important consideration to the project, but not history, right? So after these 5 days of this institute, of things like that happening, teachers went back into their classroom and they tried to lead projects like this, right? In 7 different neighborhood school contexts around the city of Chicago, right? And so all 7 teachers successfully worked with their students to define heavy metal contamination as a social justice science issue, right? All 7 of those teachers then connected that to key concepts in the chemistry curriculum. They were all successfully doing that. But then only 4 teachers actually got out in the community with their students and collected soil samples, which was one of the goals of what we were trying to do. And from there, only 2 teachers got those soil samples to scientists in enough time to get the raw data back to analyze that data with their students before the end of the school year. And then only 1 teacher actually took that data, did some activities with students to turn it into community engagement, where students actually went out and participated in a campaign, really organized a campaign around heavy metal contamination in their community, right? So 1 teacher kind of went through the full cycle. Other folks got stuck at various points. It was our first time trying this together, right? So that we viewed that as not so bad. Then we came back and we knew that we wanted to continue this theme of treating everybody's expertise on a level playing field in terms of young people, scientists, teachers, community organizers, but we knew we couldn't just rehash the structure of the first institute. So Alejandra and I designed the second institute to start with reflection, because now teachers have this experience. The most important thing to begin with then is reflecting on their experience. So Alejandra did a model presentation where she modeled challenges, successes, and envisioning, just reflecting on the projects, right? No mention of history, actually, in her model presentation. Then we gave the teachers prompts to reflect too. No mention of history in those prompts, right? And then we were in 3 small groups. Each small group had 2 teachers, 2 scientists, 2 young people. Then I was part of one of the groups, and a community organizer was part of one of the groups. And in those groups, we prepared presentations modeled after Alejandra's to share back with the larger group in our advisory board for the project that was joining us the next day, right? And so in each of these small groups who met separately, this is where this expansive shift happened, right? This is where the turn to history became more of a priority for us. And I'm gonna sort of show you how that happened and how we saw it. So this is, again, one excerpt from one of those 3 small group conversations. The audio, you'll notice, is not the best at the end. There's a vacuum cleaner in the background. I apologize for that. And before it was a little troubling to edit too. So I'm gonna explain what happened before we get to this point. Amy, one of the teachers in this group, said that one of the hardest things, one of the challenges for her and her project was helping students construct explanations about the raw environmental data that they got back, right? She was having a hard time supporting students to make that data make sense, right? And then one of her student who she brought with her said, I wish we would have done more to get out into the community and do something about it. And it's interesting because that was the only teacher who was able to actually get their students out in the community to do something, but the student wanted more of that, right? Which I thought was really cool. And then we'll pick it up from there with Mindy again being the one to raise history.
What happened to our neighborhood? Because when you look at it, you have no idea. You don't have if you're
internally, we do that map, try to connect some of the things that students learn in class and connect it to the community issues and like historical context too. But that's really interesting because even like the small little talk that Dan gave earlier about like why is the Stephen also right? And just like giving that historical context and like, well, Chicago is a traditionally very industrial city. That could be some of the reasons why there's lead in places we never even thought of, right? Or stuff like that. I mean,
Sorry for the vacuum.
I think if we could do something to add that a little bit better, it'll make the project a little bit more engaging.
We need to do, I mean, it won't be necessarily authentic to every comment, but do you remember at the institute when it took me like 3 hours to find maps of like, do you remember all of that? Yes. And then trying to make sense of what the little images meant, and that, you know, so maybe if we could, at least for our areas, like one of the days, spend a significant amount of time so that we have some foundation. And then I can say, you know, for example, we're not studying Mercury because someone for this school and we come together as a whole. I just didn't want it to be like, I talk about this just so I can be able to talk about that. Well, I mean, I think what you're saying would help with that, like, if we knew a lot of the history or not in the city, when we start to get our data back, we might be able to create some explanations instead of just doing it.
So what I want to point out that's different about this exchange than the one we heard from Institute 1 is two things. First of all, they're taking it up as a group priority, right? It's not just one teacher raised it and then we change subjects. They're taking it up as a group priority, but I think part of why they're taking it up as a group priority is that the teachers are connecting the importance of learning history with creating science explanations. So if you're familiar with the next generation science standards, creating and revising explanations is one of the 8 science and engineering practices that are prioritized, right? And so by making that connection between, we have to know history better to support our students to take up the scientific practices is really the thing that kind of starts to make this stick, right? And so the next day, this group and the 2 others came together, shared their presentations that they were preparing in these conversations with each other, and realized that they all kind of came to the same conclusion. So I'm going to play a quick comment by one of the teachers, Ryan, to show you, this is a totally separate group that met independently of the one you just heard.
So I think something that's really important,
So in this quote, what Ryan's doing is connecting learning the history of the neighborhood with a second NGSS practice of planning and carrying out investigations, right? So now we've got 1/4 of the important science and engineering practices represented and directly connected with teachers needing to know more history and support their students to understand the history in order to do the scientific practices well, right? And so at this point, what I see us doing is the teachers were facing this whole time contradictions in their practice, right? They were facing all of these different priorities that were competing for their curricular space, right? The GIS mapping, the teaching units of analysis, how do you organize a group of students to do this soil sampling, how do you have a good classroom discussion with equity of voice, all these different pedagogical concerns for science teachers, we're pulling them in different directions and creating contradictions. And here, one of those contradictions of we feel like we need to learn history is partially resolved by connecting it back to the science practices that are a priority for them.
So I think
So we're framing this and understanding this as, one of Engstrom's expansive moves in learning, right? Where science teachers made this shift and said, we need to prioritize learning history in our own professional learning as science teachers. And I want to point out two important components of sort of what got us there. The first one is that we didn't see all of this come together until teachers tried to do projects and came back and had the opportunity to reflect with each other and with others, right? So it was a situation of practice where they're reflecting on their practice in order to come to this realization. And the second thing is that this shift was really facilitated by the teacher's epistemic humility. And what I mean by epistemic humility here is I see it as having two components, right? The first one is teachers being very aware of what they don't know, right? Some of the teachers, especially that were teaching in neighborhoods where they weren't from or where they didn't live, were like, I really need to know the history of the neighborhood, right? Another teacher, Tiffany, in a group, brought to us that as soon as she started talking about lead from gasoline or lead from paint, her students raised for her, who decided it was okay to put lead in gasoline or paint? And did they know it was toxic when they decided that? And she was like, that's a good question that I need to investigate. It was another historical question of the relationships between science, industry, politics, right? So teachers were recognizing first and foremost what they didn't know and what they needed to learn. And then secondly, they were recognizing the limitations of their discipline. They were recognizing that science that they were charged with teaching, chemistry specifically, was not going to be good enough to fully understand or address these problems that mattered in the communities where they were teaching, right? So it's epistemic humility about themselves as individuals, but also epistemic humility about their content area. So I just want to close by making the sort of argument that I started with, which is that what we have here is teachers negotiating notions of equity as providing their students with access to sophisticated scientific practices and ideas, right? Which is what's usually thought of when we think of access to opportunities in STEM. Negotiating that with their commitments to address issues that matter in the communities where they teach, where their students live, in many cases where they also live, right? And so that's what I call making the shift from viewing science education through a pipeline lens to thinking about whether it can be a catalyst for change. If you're not a chemistry nerd, that is a catalytic cycle represented. So that's what I've got. I'm sorry I went a little longer than I meant to, but thank you.
We have about 10 minutes for questions. I am going to stop the recording.